I'm Bill Olson, and this is Free Speech Zone. Well, I'm kind of discombobulated this week. Monday, I was walking my dogs, and I was hit by a hit-and-run driver. It killed one of my dogs, and I haven't been able to concentrate on much else ever since. It broke my heart, and I'm still not anywhere close to healing. So consequently, I'm not exactly prepared for this show. Some of the videos I had for the show didn't make it to the studio. So we're going to go straight into this first video, and I'll try to rescue the rest of the show. But what I wanted to, before we go into that video, they love that in the control room when you do that. 9/11 was an inside job. It was a coup d'etat 14 years ago. We're coming up to the 14th anniversary of this. That means that, you know, there are people that are, say, 26 years old and less that have no clue about 9/11 except for what they heard in school, and they're spoon-fed the official lies. So it's really important to keep going back and keep reinforcing the idea it was a coup d'etat, a power struggle within the United States government that used the deaths of 3,000 of our own citizens caused by our own rogue elements in our government to change the power structure. Now, everybody's noticed everything's changed since 9/11. That's what the coup d'etat was for. The biggest transfer of wealth in history. Well, we're going to go into this video, and I'll see if we can back up what I was just saying with a little more information, but go for it.
Well, for more on all of this, let's talk to Gerald Horne, author and historian, who joins us live now here on RT International. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for talking to us. Obviously, that part of the world is pretty much a tinderbox at any time. It seems very tense at the moment. Is there a real threat, you think, that the events we're seeing over the last 12 hours or so, 24 hours, could spiral into further violence?
I'm afraid so. As you well know, what has been going on in that part of the world, in occupied Palestine, in many ways is a crime against humanity. Recall that on August 1st, 2014, a scant year ago, Amnesty International made a report just published recently that the Israeli activities at Rafah, the border crossing, consisted of F-16 fighter planes strafing innocent civilians in the streets. Therefore, it's fair to say that what we have been witnessing over the last 24 hours is consistent with a pattern that needs to be referred immediately to the United Nations Security Council for immediate action. Likewise, we need the International Criminal Court in The Hague to take quite seriously the referrals that have been made against the Israeli authorities for the various crimes they have been committing of late.
Well, do you think that's likely to happen? I mean, in this case, let's take this one for example. We've heard the details. Stones were being thrown and the soldiers responded with live fire. Do you think there's any chance that there'll be some form of punishment for these soldiers?
It's difficult to say. What I mean is, it's clear that the Israeli authorities will not do their duty and inflict severe punishment on these soldiers. That's why we need a referral to the International Criminal Court and to the United Nations Security Council. Now, routinely, the United States acts as the protector of Israel at the Security Council. But as you know, of late, relations between Israel and the United States have been declining and deteriorating because of the Iranian nuclear deal. Let us hope that the U.S. authorities do not act in their traditional manner in protecting Israel against charges of war crimes.
Obviously, Washington's relationship with Israel is strained slightly at the moment, as you've touched on. The UN has also condemned the killing of the Palestinian toddler that I mentioned a few moments ago. Is Israel facing increasing pressure here? Is it feeling isolation and pressure over the situation in the West Bank and the settlements?
Well, a key capital is Brussels. The European Union obviously needs to put more pressure on the Israeli authorities. The European Union has been acting like a second lieutenant to the United States in terms of protecting the Israeli authorities from justice. Obviously, Brussels needs to be pressured in this context.
if there is increasing pressure on Israel, do you ever see a situation where they'll back down in their support of these settlements?
It's going to take enormous external pressure. Just in the last few days, as you probably know, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has authorized the building of hundreds of more settlements in occupied Palestinian land. Obviously, this forecloses the possibility of the two-state solution and continues rampant Israeli colonialism in that part of the world. Once again, it will take enormous external pressure to get the Israelis to move away from this current path they're now pursuing.
Okay, Gerald Horne, author and historian, thank you very much for your thoughts this evening.
Okay, well, I did round up one of the videos that I wanted to show, and basically, think about this. One of the ways that this coup d'etat that I was talking about worked, or built up to it, was what I call incrementalism. Just little tiny changes in laws and little tiny changes in personnel and so on throughout the government until the right people are in the right places and the right laws are in place, and pretty soon you don't have much choice. And people like Alex Jones have been, not predicting what's going on, but simply telling you what the elite have written about their own plans. It's just like about the 9/11 thing. If you recall PNAC, that group of Wolfowitz, Cheney, all those guys, and they put out a paper in about 1 or 2 months before 9/11 saying that the changes that they wanted, in other words, global dominance and so on, would be hard to implement because, it'd be too much of a shock for the American public, who are, used to doing things legally. And so what they said is that the changes would be slow and hard coming unless there was a catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor. And of course, they were talking about their plan. They weren't just making a wish list and just by coincidence it came true. And that's how all these so-called conspiracy theorists get their information. It isn't just made up and then they go around searching for something to support it and give you weird little wispy connections. No, that's not it at all. You can go to the government training manuals and read what they're training for. You can go to preparation manuals like that FEMA puts out, and they talk about vaccinations in the time of crisis and how they suspend your right of informed consent, and so on. It's not just made up stuff. If you go and do the research yourself, you find out, first of all, that every time you go down that rabbit hole, you find that there's lots of other little rabbit holes that you can go down, and you get distracted. And you find out that there's so much, absolutely so much, that you might just shut down. It was overwhelming. But what you really need to do is specialize. Find something that, everything out there you're aware of, but you're really interested in some one point, and then focus on that, and we can report it. And that's how every one of these issues gets done. Now, the thing that we're going to be showing next is an interview with Cornel West by Paul Jay from the Real News Network. And what really caught my eye on this one, well, first of all, interracial strife is being purposely cultivated by our government right now. They're preparing for war with the citizens. And how did we get there? I mean, think about this. Black Lives Matter, all these Ferguson things shooting, on and on and on in the news constantly. But we have a black president, we have a black attorney general, and all kinds of black members of government, but it doesn't seem to make any difference. And so Cornel West has a new book out, and one of the things that he's talking about in it is how the black elite sold out. They wound up being usurped into the system. They traded their semi-violent activism from the 60s and 70s, that was driven by principle and the need to actually accomplish something. They traded that for a kind of an aggressive greed. In other words, they got the same thing that the white man has always been famous for, and that's putting money above all else. And so one by one, the important issues fall aside, and then you get these black politicians supporting things that are in nobody's best interest except maybe some rich guy, some really rich guy. When I say rich, I mean so rich you can't even conceive of it. If you can think of somebody that's a millionaire, that's not a rich guy. Okay, we're talking about trillionaires, not even billionaires anymore. Anyway, you got to understand that it's the biggest transfer of wealth in history. And if you look at it from a mafia point of view, what a successful operation, to have completely manipulated worldwide markets to put themselves into a position like that. Well, let's listen to Cornel West being interviewed by Paul J.
About terror. I've been terrorized all my day. All my day.
Welcome to Days of Revolt. I'm Chris Hedges. This is part 2 of our interview with Dr. Cornel West, where we are examining the Black prophetic tradition, which he has laid out in his great book, Black Prophetic Fire, its importance within America, and what has happened to it with the rise of neoliberalism in the wake of the civil rights movement. Welcome, Dr. West.
Blessed to be here again.
So let's take, if I'm correct, let's take the civil rights movement as the starting point. I think you've pointed out that it was a legal victory, but not an economic victory, and that with institutionalized racism, particularly in terms of economic discrimination, the creation of what Malcolm X and I think finally Martin Luther King referred to as our internal colonies, invisible walls, the very physical walls of mass incarceration. You promoted a certain segment of the black elite into what you refer to as the lumpen bourgeoisie. And yet you could argue that for the bottom 3/4 of African Americans in this country, life is maybe worse than when King marched in Selma. There was an assault against the black prophetic tradition, the most important intellectual tradition in America because of its critique of empire, its critique of poverty, its critique of systems of capitalism sustained by white supremacy. What happened to that tradition, which was given voice in the 60s through radical mass movements and our martyrs, Malcolm and Martin? How was it dismantled?
It was dismantled, one, by trying to instill a fear within black people, within poor people, within working people, so that we no longer would want to straighten our backs up and engage in collective fight back. What took the place of collective fight back was individual upward mobility. So that what was once in place, much more stronger moral conviction, we saw ruthless ambition. So you look at the formation of the black professional class, doctors, lawyers, pharmacists, professors, politicians across the board. They have much less fire. Why? Because they're much more tied to ruthless ambition than they are to moral conviction. They're much less tied to a we consciousness as opposed to just an I consciousness concerned about upward mobility. There's always going to be some prophetic professionals, but it's a small slice, and it is not connected to the energies of black poor people. It's completely severed.
But to
as
an
it were.
extent, don't they even demonize the black poor?
Well, I mean, elements of them do, and of course they not only keep a distance, but they can contribute to the callousness and the indifference toward the plight and predicament of the black poor and poor people across the board. So what happens? Well, your warriors end up incarcerated or killed. You get your professionals who surface at the top. They tend to be nerdy, smart, self-promoting, not taking any risks, very little courage, highly conformist, and usually when it comes to battle, complacent. On the other hand, you say, oh, we've got memories of the social movements. And of course, when we talk about the civil rights movement, there is no civil rights victories without the rebellions of Watts.
That's right.
Without Newark, Detroit, we can go on and on and on. Plainfield had the rebellion right after Newark and so forth. But of course, oftentimes these precious poor people, they were not the beneficiaries of it. Their bodies, their sacrifice did generate the conditions under which this new black middle class could move into place. But what did it do? For the most part, that black middle class, driven by ruthless ambition, became well adjusted to injustice and well adapted to indifference. And so they may point to a Martin Luther King Jr. every January, but Martin Luther King Jr. of 1965 and 1966 and 1968 have no place in how they go about living their lives, engaging in their politics. And of course, black folk, for the most part, became just extensions of a milquetoast neoliberal Democratic Party. But Adolph Reed and a host of others told this story many, many years ago. It's becoming much more crystallized, and we have to be willing to tell the truth no matter how unpopular it is.
Well, King becomes frozen in that 1963 I Have a Dream speech, and you published a book of King's, it's Radical King.
Radical King. Anti-imperialist, anti-empire.
And a socialist. And I'm going to read just a little passage from that book that I loved. And it's what your definition of an intellectual, and I said before we began, I would like to know which tenure committee in the American educational system is going to embrace this.
I've never given a damn about tenure other than getting in a position to take care of my family. But if I've got to get tenure and can't tell the truth, tenure can kiss my black behind. But go right ahead.
The vocation of the intellectual, this is Dr. West, is to let suffering speak, let victims be visible, and let social misery be put on the agenda of those in power. And second, that moral action is based on a broad, robust propheticism that highlights systemic social analysis of the circumstances under which tragic persons struggle. So talk about that, because we have seen such a corruption, not just of the black intellectual class, but the white intellectual class. They have sold themselves to a neoliberal agenda, which is promoted widely within academia. Many of these elite colleges and universities are virtually corporations themselves. Talk about that concept of the organic intellectual and what happened, what's taken place.
Well, one is you have to keep track of what the prophetic intellectuals are up against. Massive commodification, big money, big banks, big corporations trying to incorporate black voices, white voices, brown voices, intellectuals, academics, to in many ways keep them distant from a prophetic tradition that will bring critique to bear, not just in a narrow talk about discrimination, not just in a narrow talk about liberal reform, but of a highly financialized monopoly capitalist system which is global, in which, as we see in Greece, the big banks dictate and the poor people suffer.
Right.
Same is true in Latin America, same is true in the United States with Wall Street. Probably the biggest challenge when it comes to the black freedom struggle is in 2008, when you actually have a black president who can say in March of 2009 with the biggest CEOs of the biggest banks, I stand between you and the pitchforks, I'm on your side, I will protect you. But when he speaks to black people, it's paternalistic or a symbolic gesture. Now finally he's made it to the prisons, highly deodorized prisons, you don't see prisoners. selected prisoners, nonviolent persons,
Right.
as opposed to a larger population. You and I, of course, have been blessed to teach it
Right.
at Rawway with our precious brothers there in philosophy and history and so forth. Very different dynamic. What happens then? Well, the black political class and the black professional class follows his Pied Piper, neoliberal, pro-drone, pro-massive surveillance, pro-Israeli occupation, pro-ecological devastation with drilling. Thank God for Brother Bob McKibben and the others. And we have to say what? Well, even if we're at the moment lone voices or relatively lone voices, this great tradition will not be suffocated in the name of some empty victory of a black professional or political class that cannot speak to the suffering that these structures produce.
Has the election of a black president in Barack Obama been, maybe since the assaults of the 1960s, the most devastating thing for the black prophetic tradition?
No, I think it's the big banks, it's Wall Street, it's Pentagon, it's State Department, it's military budget that's been much more devastating. It's the privatizing of education that's been more devastating. But at the political level, it's contributed to that devastation.
But I meant in the sense that it has essentially, with all of those forces that you just named,
yes,
it has seduced a segment of the blacks to essentially back what under the black prophetic tradition they had understood as the evils within the American system.
Absolutely. That's why I wouldn't say that it's the major force. It's the force that is hidden and conceal the devastation of Wall Street, Pentagon, State Department, so forth and so on, with the window dressing.
Right.
With the window dressing, you see. And Brother Barack Obama, he is a master at smoke and mirrors. He's a master at window
that's why he
dressing.
is where he is.
That's it, absolutely. So when I spend the time with the young folk in St. Louis and Ferguson and Oakland, we just had a wonderful gathering of Brother Pastor Michael McBride's church, The Way there on University Avenue in Berkeley. Unbelievably prophetic. The awakening is taking place. Why? Police murder is something one cannot avoid. You have to come to terms with it. Sandra Bland, we can go on and on and on. And it's wonderfully led more and more by not just black sisters, but black queer sisters. So you can hit the issues of homophobia, why you hit the issues of male supremacy, why you hit the issues of white supremacy. But in the end, if you're not hitting monopoly capitalism, if you're not hitting the imperial policies that flow therefrom, you're still not going to be at the root of what we need to come to terms with.
Isn't the election of Obama really a kind of window into internal colonialism, in a sense that colonial powers would find an indigenous, largely aristocratic elite who would profit personally from the oppression? Isn't it a species of internal colonialism?
In a certain sort, but even among the black masses, there's such deep desperation. There's a hunger for even symbolic victory, because the class war against working and poor people has been so intense. And we were relatively defeated in the sense of the massive transfer of wealth from poor and working people to the well-to-do. The 1% who have been getting off scot-free. What is it now? Almost 40% of the wealth.
Right.
1% of the population under Obama got 95% of the wealth under his administrations. You see, that kind of unbelievable wealth inequality you have to come to terms with that if we don't just go off a cliff. I mean, it may be the case that the white supremacy, the male supremacy, and the xenophobia and the capitalist ethos cut so deep, America would rather just blow up the world and go off a cliff than talk about justice. But I mean, that's why we are a blues people. You see, we know it's catastrophic. That ain't no news at all. The question is what you gonna do with the catastrophe. Are you gonna go down fighting and swinging? Or are you gonna be scared and intimidated and afraid? Are you gonna tell the truth or say what needs to be said for your career?
Well, they've done a pretty good job of shutting down truth tellers in this society, and they've mounted a pretty vicious campaign against you on black radio.
No, but the reality is that I'm stronger than ever. I'm stronger now than I was 6 years ago. Not just intellectually, but spiritually and politically. You see, the only way they're going to completely snuff me out is to put a bullet in my heart, and death, where is thy sting? Grave, where is thy victory? So in that sense, it's not just me, it's being willing to sustain memory. That's what this book is about.
Right.
Subversive memory of the great ones who came before, integrity, not cupidity, and then tenacity, spiritual, political tenacity. The only way you snuff us out is to do away with us, and here's more to take one's place. That's also what Ferguson is about.
And
we got more Michael Browns, we got more Tanishas, we got more Tamirs and so forth coming.
And you know, as we had said earlier, the use of lethal force by police against black people, there are just as many black people being shot dead a few decades ago as there are today.
Absolutely.
But there is a consciousness.
Absolutely.
Now.
Absolutely.
And
with a black president, black attorney general, black homeland security in the cabinet, all the young folk, elderly folk, men, women still getting shot. How many police going to jail? Hardly any at all. That says something about the system and how decrepit and rotten it is, rather than just somehow being Obama worshipers or worshipers of the newest black politician to come along and say that somehow he or she is going to provide some kind of delivery system of justice.
And does the black prophetic tradition, when you are with activists from Ferguson, and is there, after this kind of long hiatus where the black prophetic tradition was successfully pushed to the margins of American intellectual life and American society, do you see a rekindling of it among?
Oh, absolutely. Oh, the rekindling is deep. You don't see it on corporate media.
Right.
Not at all. You see it on your show. You see it in Real News. You see it Amy Goodman, a few other sites. But it's spilling over. And actually, it won't really spill over to corporate media until it constitutes a threat to the status quo.
But then won't they demonize it?
Well, they demonize, but even when you demonizing folk who constitute a threat, even that is insufficient and inadequate. But at that point, you either have to make some serious concessions, you have to kill us off, and some new ones take our place, or what we really want, which is fundamental transformation. I'm a revolutionary Christian. I think in the end we need fundamental transformation of capitalism.
Oh, exactly.
Fundamental transformation of patriarchy, fundamental transformation of white supremacy, male supremacy, homophobia, right across the board.
And you name King as a revolutionary, and I think that this is something that we have to grapple with. And it was you who had me read Hofstadter's great essay on vigilante violence, which I used in my book,
the last book,
Wages of
the
Rebellion.
great historian wrote.
But King, you write in Black Prophetic Fire, in many ways understood that we needed a revolution, but feared deeply that we were only capable of a counter-revolution.
That's real.
And that is a reality of American life.
That's very real. That's very real. Yeah, that's always a skeleton hanging in one's closet as a progressive or revolutionary. But you just don't know. History is so unpredictable. No one has control over it. It looks that way. The evidence tilts in that direction, but you just don't know. It could be the case, for example, that when it comes to the greediness of the big banks, that lo and behold, people who view themselves as conservatives but are deeply victimized, who have an empathy or moral sensitivity, may even come to your side in ways that you hadn't predicted. You just don't know. You fight anyway. But most importantly, it's the issue of integrity, honesty, and decency. Everybody's going to die fairly soon anyway. So the question is, do you want to live a life of integrity, honesty, and decency, tell the truth, and fight for justice? And wherever the consequences flow, let it flow. Martin was like that. I mean, one of the differences between Brother Martin and myself is that he's a pacifist. See, I'm not a pacifist. You see, I believe nonviolence ought to be pursued given all of the options, but sometimes you have no alternative but self-defense. No alternative but self-defense.
Well, that's what Malcolm, I mean, I can't remember whether it was James Cone or may have been you or somebody wrote that Malcolm didn't have the luxury to be nonviolent.
And that's Brother Jim Combs' profound insight, absolutely. And, you know, there's a sense in which even Martin, if you pushed him, would mess with precious kids in Coretta.
Yeah. Well, he in the
still would
beginning he
probably
kept
out.
the
And he had a gun
kept
in the
pistol
house.
in the house
Yes, he did.
when
It
they
was
bombed his
Coretta
house.
who pushed him in the name of Gandhi, absolutely. But I mean, the reason why you say that is because you want to make sure that the world knows that even as one attempts to be a love warrior like Martin or like Ella Baker, Ida B. Wells, that you are a fighter, you're a warrior. Of course you believe in reaching out and keeping track of the humanity of others. I even believe in forgiveness as a Christian, but I don't believe in premature forgiveness.
I want to ask you a question about forgiveness.
Yes,
And it
yes.
comes from an essay by James Baldwin.
The great James Baldwin.
You cannot understand America if you do not read James Baldwin.
That's the
and,
truth.
For me,
That's
as
the
a
truth.
writer,
That's why we got to defend James Baldwin
Yes,
these
which
days.
you
There's
have
some
been.
reductionism going on, but we won't get into that right now.
Right. Well, yes, this was, I think, the great writer Toni Morrison linking Mr. Coates.
And Toni Morrison is one of the greatest of the greats, but I just disagree with my dear sister. And Coates has a very important voice, but at the same time, he's got to be connected to fight back hope. He's got to be connected to the social movements. He's got to be connected to the insurgency that's taking place among the young folk. It can't just be spectatorial, even given
Right.
certain truths that he puts forward. Baldwin was always tied
Right.
to fight back.
And Baldwin has a moment where he visits his father when his father is dying in a Long Island hospital. And like Richard Wright, Baldwin had a very contentious relationship with his father.
put it
left home,
lightly.
left to put it
Yes,
lightly.
that's right.
It's actually his stepfather.
Stepfather,
right?
that's right.
He leaves home as his older half-brother, walked out, would never speak to his father again. Richard Wright has the same thing. And there are moments, there's two moments in Black Boy and in Baldwin where they go back, Wright goes back and his father's a broken sharecropper. And Baldwin goes back and his father is curled up in a fetal position, dying on a bed. And they both, Wright and Baldwin, write about forgiveness, which in a kind of brilliant way. So these were oppressive forces, and I don't think that we can be asked to forgive our oppressors. But once power is taken from them, both Wright and Baldwin say they didn't recognize that figure. I mean, you in the book talk about Pharaoh, when you talk about Obama, is it not hypocritical to raise one's voice when Pharaoh is white, but have no critical word to say when the Pharaoh is black? If the boot is on our neck, does it make any difference what color the foot is in the boot? And I'm going to ask you to close to reflect on forgiveness, in relationship to oppression and how it works.
Yeah, see, for me, forgiveness is the highest form of love, and you begin with loving yourself, loving your mama and your daddy and your sisters and brothers, and allow that love to spill over to all of humanity. The problem is that we have too many black people who love everybody but black people. And therefore that's pathological. There's something sick about that. It's called white supremacy at the psychic level, at the spiritual level. And therefore, if you're not loving the people who have been treated like cockroaches, but forgiving the folk who are treating them like cockroaches, that's not Christianity, that's not psychically healthy, that is pathological. I do believe, and here I am deeply a Christian, I do believe that one should not hate when one is hated. I think you should hate injustice. And the reason why you don't hate the person who perpetuates injustice is because they can change. You don't want to trump their sense of possibility.
Right.
White supremacists can change. Capitalists can change. Patriarchal folk can change. You don't make a political program on that. The political program has to be an analysis of structure, mobilizing against structure, and unbelievable resistance. Street, jail, clash, and work within the electoral political system when there's possibility. So in that sense, I think that a lot of talk about forgiveness is just a special kind of talk about black people remaining calm, serene, halcyon, deferential and unwilling to straighten their backs up and fight.
Can we forgive the oppressor while the oppressor is engaged in oppression?
Not if it takes the form of a love of oppression that downplays the effects of the oppression and therefore dehumanizes those who are oppressed. You begin loving, 25th chapter, Matthew, the least of these, the poor, the prisoner, the homeless, the orphan, the widow, the fatherless, the motherless. Not just the people of your tribe who look like you.
Right.
Palestinian lives,
Right.
lives in Yemen, lives in Pakistan, lives in Europe, lives in, have the same status as lives in the United States.
Well, that's what Father Daniel Berrigan once said to me was faith. The faith that the good draws to it the good.
Yeah,
and there empirically may be no evidence to prove that. But, you know, the Buddhists call it karma. It is that belief that I think exemplifies your life. And your
But it
work.
lets the powerful know that no matter how powerful they are, they can never snuff out the love, snuff out the struggle for justice, snuff out the resistance and the resiliency. We keep coming. Shoot us down, we keep coming. Lie on us, we keep coming. Subordinate us, we keep coming.
Great.
That's the fight back.
Thank you very much.
It's a joy to be part of the fight back, though. And you know better as much as I do, my brother. Love you, though, man.
Thank you. Me too.
Yeah.
Okay, now
Thank you very much.
that was one of the videos that was really important, and I made a mistake in saying that it was a Paul J. interview. It was Chris Hedges, of course. What it was that I had two clips, and this clip that we're going to see next is Chris Hedges being interviewed by Paul J. And the subject is the moral imperative of revolution, or the wages of revolution. It's a discussion about violence versus nonviolence, and a discussion around the fact that, you know, none of the civil rights acts would have been successful during the 60s had there not been, you know, riots in Watts. That doesn't mean that there needs to be that equivalent today, but it just hooks in with what Cornel West was saying about, you know, trading your former principle-driven protest for something different. In that case, the black elites were, of course, going for the gold. So, anyway, I see the control room is just signaling me that the video is ready to go. It is. Hey, I guessed right. I was just putting pressure on them. Okay, roll it.
Welcome back to Reality Asserts Itself on the Real News Network. Continuing our discussion with Chris Hedges about his new book, Wages of Rebellion. Thanks for joining us again, Chris.
Thank you.
One of the themes in your book is the role of violence in revolution. And you talk about violence can be a poison for revolution. But certainly there's times where violence has been necessary for certain revolutions. We talked a little bit off camera about the Cuban Revolution. I mean, most revolutions have had some kind of violence. And you quote Marx a lot, and I quoted you this off camera. Marx says force is the midwife of change. So, you know, when you're at some point, there may be. I mean, how do you deal with it?
Well, most effective force is not necessarily violent. And I quote Crane Brinton and Davies, the two great theorists on revolution, early on in the book, who argue, I think correctly, that every successful revolution has included either a defection on the part of significant levels of the organs of internal security, including the military, or a decision by those organs not to use force to defend a discredited power elite. And I think that does hold true for every revolution, whether it's the Cossacks refusing to fire on the crowds in Petrograd, whether it's the refusal of the Iranian military to defend the Shah after he flees, Same we saw in Cuba. When Bautista flees, then the military will no longer fight, and you have trucks of barbudos, Castro and his guerrillas riding as fast as they can into Havana.
But they had won victories in the field, Castro's troops. I mean,
right, but
it's
not. But not.
It was a combination of mass
sure,
movement
they had,
and armed.
but I don't think that was the tipping point in terms of what allowed the Cuban Revolution to succeed. I mean, if you look at the Algerian, which was it wasn't a revolution, but if you look at the Algerian War of Independence, by the time France finally pulled out of Algeria, the FLN was largely defeated, living in bases in Tunisia. But the French were just exhausted. So I think that we're watching it in Iraq. I mean, the Iraqi armed forces have no real will to power, no real desire to fight. They're, heavily outgunned, outnumber ISIS, and yet they drop their weapons and flee. So I think that is a fundamental point in revolution, and that means that revolutionary forces are able to expose a discredited elite for who it is. And I think we live now in the midst of what Antonio Gramsci would call an interregnum, a period where we have very little faith in our ruling elite. Congress has an approval rating of 7%?
On a good day.
On a good day. You have a host of measures, which we mentioned earlier, from the TPP and wholesale surveillance, et cetera, bailing out Wall Street, that have no popular support. Nobody wants it, but we get it anyway. But in that interregnum, you have yet to articulate, as we spoke of earlier, a vision to take its place. And so there's the ideological foundations, neoliberalism, globalism, no longer have currency. The lies that were used to sell us this belief system, that if a global elite became rich, money would trickle down and everyone would have jobs, I think people realize is false. Alexander Berkman, I also quote his essay, Invisible Revolution, in the book, where he said that, this period of a loss of faith in the ideas that buttress a ruling elite he likens it to water boiling in a kettle. So you don't see it, it's subterranean. Suddenly you just see the steam and hear the whistle. And I think that's where we are. I think we're moving. Now, if we can't articulate a vision, if we can't articulate a structure for society that we would like to take the place of corporate capitalism, then because corporate capital has no internal restraints, it does what it always does, which is maximize profit at the expense of the ecosystem and human societies. And it has no external, virtually, restraints anymore in terms of regulation or government control, then you are going to get pushback, blowback. But if that blowback is not wedded to an alternative vision, it becomes chaotic and anarchic and is easily crushed. And I think this gets back to the point you raised about Black Lives Matter, that it needs to wed itself to a radical political vision to propel it forward, because then it's no longer a reactive force. It's an offensive force. And that's the period we're in. Now, whether we'll get there, I don't know, because the only people who have a clearly demarcated ideological position are the proto-fascists, who are quite numerous in American society, the white supremacists, the neo-Confederates, the Tea Party, the Christian right, the militias, the lunatic fringe of the Republican Party, which may be the entire party. They have a very frightening vision, which is veneration of the hypermasculinity and violence of the military culture. It's racist. It does what all fascist movements do, which is blame the vulnerable, Muslims, undocumented workers, African Americans, feminists, intellectuals, liberals, for society's decline. If things go down, let's say Wall Street, we get another 2008-like crash, then these forces may be able to seize control. I mean, I find the militarization of American society and the venerating of all things military to be very, very disturbing. So we on the left need to begin to articulate a vision of what we want, and we're not there yet.
Yeah, I think it's very clear that this elite is not fit to rule,
Right.
but no one else is either, in the sense that there's no vision
Right.
for that. And we're kind of caught right now.
Well, we better get one fast because,
better.
you know, if we don't articulate it before whatever crisis hits us, it may be very difficult to articulate afterwards. There may not be space to articulate it.
I want to return to one thing you said earlier. You had a big fight critique of the black bloc tactic during Occupy, and I agreed with that critique, and I did when I analyzed what was going on in the G20 events in Toronto. I had a very similar critique, that the 100 or 150 young people or whoever was in the black bloc tactic and burned a police car and broke windows in Toronto, it played into the hands of the police.
They love it.
But what happened in Baltimore changed my mind about a piece of that, not the black bloc tactic, which was quite like a small group, way out ahead of everyone, kind of marginal, but the spontaneous upsurge of young people who have just had enough, who were cornered by the cops, and start throwing stones. I don't know about the burning of the building, I don't know who actually did it, but even if you include it, because it represented a kind of more spontaneous mass response, it really did threaten, create a fear in the way black bloc plays in the hands of the police. Well, this caught everyone by surprise. The visions of what happened across the United States after the death of Dr. King, and the concession by Mosby on charging the cops, that's the state's attorney, the fact that they bring in the National Guard and all the rest, which was, I think, complete overkill and unnecessary, and they did it as a rehearsal for martial law, which we've said before. But there was something about that spontaneous violence. I mean, it wasn't how violent as throwing stones, but it was something that had a kind of radical character to it in the way black bloc tactics don't.
But you nailed it. I mean, because it was authentic. Black bloc isn't. So let's take Oakland. Now, you know, I was speaking with Ishmael Reed and other African-American leaders in Oakland. They were very angry at the black bloc, who they characterized as white, male, middle-class kids coming down from Eugene, Oregon, camping out in Oakland in $600 worth of knee pads and everything else, throwing bricks through windows of, you know, local stores. And as Ishmael said, look, you know, if they want to go up to La Jolla, which is where Romney lives, and throw bricks through the windows of rich people's houses, go ahead. But don't come into our city and do this. And I was in a march. They shut down 4 elementary schools in Oakland. And I went and joined the march, you know, through my friends who were there, the African-American leadership, which we have to pay homage to the African-American leadership in Oakland. It is, you know, some of the most politicized, most radical, most courageous of all kind of resistance movements in America. And they've been fighting longer, harder, you know, and you don't walk into Oakland without venerating those people and listening to them. So when we did this march against the closing of the elementary schools, the African-American leaders had told the black bloc, you're not welcome, you can't march with us. And look, you go back and look at counterinsurgency tactics, and if you pull, you know, the 10 goals of any counterinsurgency campaign, it is to demonize the resistance movement and make that movement frightening to the masses. And that's exactly what black bloc did. They were a gift to the security and surveillance state. I think half of them were probably cops anyway. And
half, I think, well, certainly based on the Toronto experience, half is a big exaggeration.
Okay, but
big exaggeration.
I'm exaggerating, but I mean, certainly the
I
cops
think
were in there.
in the Toronto situation, most were young activists.
But there are cops in there. We know.
We know there were.
Yeah, because we
No
have
doubt.
Margaret Flowers got pictures of 2 people dressed as black bloc getting out.
Oh,
the
in
back of the
Toronto,
police. Yeah.
some of the people that had infiltrated wound up testifying in
Right.
cases.
So we know they're there, and they egg it on, and that's what happened in Baltimore. So we had 4 days of peaceful protest, but what got all the pictures? It got these young kids who we know were harassed as they got out of school and kind of pushed to the limit, and that's what the state does. And so you even have the president calling them thugs and criminals. And that's immediately what the state will attempt to do. And I think what frightened the state with the Occupy movement in New York were these, and I saw it every weekend, these mothers and fathers coming to Zuccotti, pushing their strollers up and down the park. That terrified them. And there's a place for those radical movements, But my argument with the black bloc is you don't have a right to come into the midst of a nonviolent protest and carry out a tactic that you're not sharing with anyone else. The consequences of that for undocumented workers, for parents with children, for the elderly, for disabled people, is catastrophic. And you may, as a young person, be able to take off and run down a side street, but they can't. An undocumented worker who's out there, their family, their entire life is destroyed if they're picked up. And you don't have a right to make them pay that price. So I'm not going to snitch on the black bloc. I mean, if they want to go up to La Jolla and break all of Romney's windows, I'm not going to report them to the police. Yet at the same time, they were a very destructive element within the movement, and I think the state played them like a violin.
Yeah, I thought a lot of the black leadership and young activist leadership in Baltimore took quite a good position on the stone throwing and the sort of more violent response, even the looting, which was, it's not the tactic we recommend, but there's no way we're going to condemn our people for using such a tactic.
Right. Well, that is the difference between what happened in Oakland and happened in Baltimore. The people who carried out, that stone throwing in Baltimore were from Baltimore, and they were expressing, an anger of being kind of pushed beyond the breaking point, which was legitimate, which is why the state was fearful of it, and why the state is not fearful from the black bloc.
I mean, there were some people that took advantage of the moment. There were a lot of pharmacies broken in and drugs taken and so on, but it's all expression of the same underlying social problem.
Right. Well, it is, and I mean, let's compare it to the looting on Wall Street. It's kind of nothing. You grab a package of Pampers at a CVS and run down a street. You spend months in jail or get shot in the back. You steal $500 million from Lehman Brothers, and every college in the country wants you to sit on their trustee board. So,
of course, it's not over in Baltimore. People are waiting to see what happens with the
no, and
the trial
I
of the cops.
I don't have a lot of faith in the system, and they probably don't either.
Let's go back in terms of where we left off about the role of this street violence. The idea of articulating a vision that people can fight for. So how do we get there?
Well, I think that when you see the censorship in the corporate media, it is targeted at those who seek to articulate that vision. Chomsky, Nader, myself. We're never going to get on mainstream because deconstructing the criminality of corporate capitalism and offering an alternative vision is one that the corporate controlled media has done a very good job of censoring out. I mean, what's interesting about living in this species of corporate totalitarianism, or what Sheldon Wolin calls inverted totalitarianism, is that you can have access to that, but it's largely reduced to print. And because so few people read, the state doesn't really see the articulation of those visions in print as a threat, nor do they see those of us who have been pushed to the margins who attempt to articulate this vision as a threat. Now, when you rise up even to reach the City Council of Seattle, as Shama Sawan has done, it's interesting that even at that level, if they percolate up to that level, that is a threat.
Well, we'll see what happens if we're successful with this real news model in Baltimore, with our objective is to compete with and defeat local corporate news. If we win a big market share here, which I think is possible, we'll see how we get dealt with then, because we'll perhaps rise to that level. I want to just raise one other thing, which I thought we talked a bit about Bernie Sanders' candidacy, and I understand, the critique of Sanders. But it's interesting, there was a poll that just came out asking Americans if they would vote for a socialist. And some of the newspapers I saw that carried the headline, they spun the polling results as if it was a negative, which was, I think one of the headlines was only I think it was 48 or 47% of Americans say they'll vote for a socialist.
Oh, really? Well, that's pretty good. We'll take that.
It doesn't take 47% to elect somebody.
Right.
I mean, after so many decades of Cold War propaganda, it's a very interesting thing that that's the polling
right,
results.
Because the demonization of socialism kind of ended in '89. And so you have an entire generation, the last 25, 26 years, of people who, unlike you and I, weren't pounded with this Red Scare junk. And so when they hear the word socialism, it doesn't have the connotation that it had for our generation when we were growing up.
I mean, it's another indictment of mass media, which is if 47% of the country is willing to consider voting for a socialist, how come you never hear those voices on the mass media?
Well, because a half dozen corporations control what we watch and listen to.
Yeah, sure.
And, that's why they locked Nader out of the debate. And part of my frustration with Sanders is that he's clearly cut a deal with the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party is part of the problem. He won't critique the Democratic Party. And it's not hypothetical, because when I did an event with him in New York with Shama Sawan and Bill McKibben and Naomi Klein, we asked him beforehand why he wouldn't run as an independent, which is what he should have done. And he said, I don't want to end up like Nader. Well, and he's right, because he would have become a pariah, he would have been stripped of his committee chairmanships, the Democratic establishment would have attempted to crush him going even when he ran for re-election in Vermont. He's not wrong, because I watched what they've done to Ralph. On the other hand, we desperately need somebody to stand up and begin to name the Democrats for who they are.
But he could do that running in the Democratic Party primary.
He's not going to do that.
He may not, but as a tactic, he could do it. He would have a much more mainstream stage to do it.
He wouldn't get on the debates. And I think that, the Democratic Party is, I don't know this for a fact, but I'm assuming that the deal is you have to support the nominee if you're going to get on the debates. And they'd lock him out of the debates the way they locked Kucinich out of the debates. Remember, they invented all these rules, like you have to be in the top 4, and by the time it was New Hampshire, I think, or I forget which state it was, he was in the top 4, and then they just rewrote the rules. It was mostly out of healthcare. They didn't want Dennis on.
What are they going to just have a debate between O'Malley and Clinton?
I don't know. Maybe we'll just watch Clinton kind of parade back and forth across the stage like
Maybe
the Queen of
there won't
England.
be any debates.
Yeah. I mean, so, I have mixed feeling about Sanders. He's not running the typical campaign, which is based on a manufactured personality. He's actually running on issues. He does not take on the military, by the way, at all. If you look on his website, there's no mention of the military, which is the military-industrial complex is the institution that is largely hollowing the country out from the inside. It's running our national surveillance. It's sucking down $1 trillion a year. I mean, 600 and some billion, but then there's another 400 billion hidden in other budgets. I have an emotional level, because I spent so many months of my life in Gaza and the West Bank. I just can't betray the Palestinian people and his betrayal of the Palestinian people. I'm not saying for other people.